organizers for inviting me to this exciting conference. Because I gathered the idea that in this conference there would be many young scholars engaging in their doctoral dissertations, or after finishing it having to write papers. I decided to focus on methodological issues. So I hope, well, this work is drawing from the work with my colleagues in the University of Santiago, from the RODA Research Group, Blanca Puig, Sabela Monteira, and Pablo Brocos, and also because our research program is about classroom studies with teachers and students from early childhood education, primary, secondary schools, and teacher education. Oh, I'm not very good with, and especially because one of the studies that I'm going to discuss is in early childhood, this wonderful group that is, oh, thank you very much, a professional learning community of early childhood education teachers. This only to show, because some people have been asking me where Santiago is, so you know that is Spain, and the little part just over Portugal is Galicia and Santiago, and I know that about 5,000 Korean people every year take the Santiago pilgrimage. So perhaps you will like also to do it. Well, methodological issues are always a problem, and so a bit what I plan to do is to frame very quickly methodological debates, and then debriefing some processes leading to what we can say that are quality research studies and papers. So that's why I choose a paper published in the social science citation in the journal that we have in science education with a higher impact, that is the Journal of Research in Science Teaching, and the other is in a book by Springer. And I choose to work on our work that was published because I'm going to show the processes leading from the initial versions to the final versions. So an overview will be something about framing methodological debates, but this I think I will have to skip because of the time, but my paper is in the book, not just the PowerPoint presentation, but it's a Word document, so you have there much longer than I will explain some issues about methodology. And the overarching question will be something as what is empirical evidence about engagement in argumentation in qualitative studies, and how can modifications in the process, either of doing research or of writing a report, a paper, contribute to identifying it. So that's why I say that I'm focusing on process of modification in research steps into published classroom studies. The concerns underlying the questions are which type of evidence is appropriate for qualitative studies, because I think that most of us have a relatively clear idea of what is evidence in quantitative studies, but when having to act as referee, or either for conferences or for journals, we see a lot of confusion about this. And also, related to this, how to keep the coherence among research questions, research design, construction of rubrics, analysis, findings, and conclusions. As I was saying, an overarching concern is the need for systematic approaches. I was unable to locate a meta-analysis of reasons for rejection in science education, but this figure is in a medical journal, and apparently the biggest part, 30%, is the reason for rejection is poor research, and also in science education, at least in my experience, referring methodological problems. I will draw on the work of Greg Kelly and Judith Green when they compared the benefits and the challenges of quantitative and qualitative. Of course, taking into account that this should be as opposing approaches, but rather as part of a continuum. So larger scale quantitative studies are appropriate to document what we call the current state, and of course seeking generalizability. But qualitative studies that emphasize the socially constructed nature of events seek to analyze the processes of knowledge construction, so how and why this current state was constructed. So that's why they are complementary. But at the same time, they may have problems. So sometimes quantitative studies may lack the sensitivity to examine how access to learning is constructed. And again, following Kelly and Green, qualitative studies sometimes do not provide systematic and theoretically grounded approaches. And this is from a book. I see that the transition from Macintosh to this system is not leading to see, but you can find the reference in the book. This is a book that has been published this month, and I think is an edited volume by Gregory Kelly and Judith Green, Theory and Methods for Sociocultural Research in Science and Engineering Education. And I think we have a need for a specific work about methodology in science education, because many times we draw from general work. So probably many studies about research will agree that in qualitative, and of course in other type of studies, we need to ask and refine robust research questions that, if possible, may be answered empirically. You may take pictures, but I assure you that all this is written on the book in a much more detailed way. Second, planning and modifying appropriate research design, and particularly identifying relevant data sources that answer our research questions. Constructing specific analytical tools, and in this case, to analyze particular dimensions in argumentation. Because I'm going to discuss results from two studies. One is about use of evidence by early childhood education children. And so what we may call the entry points in argumentation, learning progression, or something like this. And the other one is about what we are currently studying, that are non-structural dimensions of argumentation. So, for instance, the influence of negotiation. Drawing conclusions supported in data, and constructing representations to discuss our data. And for classroom studies, that, as I was saying, is our research program, we argue that what we need are data about performances, function, or discourse, rather than other kind of data. So, first study was published in 2016 in the Journal of Science Teaching. Is Pilar Jiménez-Aleixandre, the practice of using evidence in kindergarten, the role of purposeful representation. And it was further selected by a joint committee NAST and STA as research worth reading. It is part of a longitudinal study. Isabella, the researcher, was there 3 years accompanying this classroom with the same teacher since they were 3-year-old until they were 6 and left for primary. Well, and contribution is purposeful observation, but I don't think I have time to go into this, perhaps later. Well, to have a look at how our data look for this age, these studies with 5-year-old, 5-6, but we have also data for 3-year-old, and a big part of our data look like this. We have about 500 drawings along the study. So here, again, I am afraid that is out of the frame, so it's not very easy to see, but it's the teacher wrote conclusion, and they have to write the conclusion of the experiment under this. So first step, I want to share with you how we changed our research questions. Thanks, in this case, to the referees and editors of the journal. Because the first formulation of the first research question was, that is written there, to examine the meanings for what constitutes evidence constructed during the project. This happens many times. I've been writing a lot of papers, I've been many years doing research, but sometimes even when you produce the first version, you make something that is really very general. So, after four versions, for coming and going, asking for reject and resubmission, all this, you have to be patient. Well, the last version that is now published in the paper says what meanings is formulated. The first was an objective, and this is a research question with an interrogation. What meanings do kindergarteners construct for what constitutes evidence? And in particular, a second part was added. How are those meanings reflected in the development of data into evidence? The blue is the change. Why? Because our data, really, something interesting in the paper is to see, we were there a full year, and the project, that's the good thing in kindergarten, the project that these teachers do every year take from January to June. And during this time, well, we were having some data about the development of data into evidence, and I will define how we differentiate this later. And this was in the study, but was not in the research question. So again, I say that the referee work is very important. Well, these are the other research questions, but I don't have time to go into them. And the second study that is published as a chapter in Archidiacono and Boba book about interpersonal argumentation, processes of negotiation of socio-scientific argumentation about vegetarianism in teacher education. And this is a different context. Well, it's part of a thesis about the development of criteria in arguments about sustainable and healthy diets. And again, if we see the first version of the research question, and this was due also to our discussion, also some suggestion from the editors, was to examine the processes of negotiation about the choice or option to be agreed by the group. But after a year and 3 versions of the chapter, finally it was what is written below: which dimensions have greater weight in the negotiation process and in the final decisions. That you can see that both research questions, the one for the study in kindergarten and the one for the study with teacher education, exemplify common problems that we encounter when we review papers for journals. Like questions are too general, they lack a sharp focus, or they fail to capture the specificities of the issue studied. No? So, these 2 questions were developed, but I only wanted to show how you must be prepared to change this. Sometimes the first version is excellent, but it's only in a small amount of so, second step in the research process or in writing a paper. This is more about the research process, modifying the research design. So, for instance, designing collection of different data that may provide evidence of actions and processes. I'm going only to focus on research question 1, the one that we saw before. So for the transformation of raw data into evidence, the sources, the pupils' dialogue, but also the representations, the drawings. So these were used to see how criteria for what is evidence was developed. And in teacher education, and I know that this is very small, but this is a representation of the whole study, because it is a design-based research. So how we used the data from the first and second cycle up in the figure to design data collection and to design the tasks in the third cycle that was in high school. Because, for instance, we encountered a problem that was mentioned also by Professor King. That is that in a lot of groups, in teacher education, in small groups, they decided first, they wrote, we are going to take the option vegetarian to defend this, to make an argument, before discussing the evidence, that in this case was a big amount of evidence, a lot of data across different dimensions. So, in order to promote the evaluation, a different scheme was used, promoting the explicit consideration of values, because the question of diets has, besides scientific dimensions, ethical and cultural dimensions, and scaffolding the process. A third step that is, part of the methods, but is that many times in science education we need to construct analytical tools specific to our data. So in this case, we wanted to document the transformation of raw data into evidence in the oral discourse of these kindergarten children. So we proceeded to data reduction and discourse analysis by constant comparison in several iterations. There were 7 iterations analysis. So at the end we decided to have two levels of analysis. The first one was to identify what in the discourse were argument components, and from this focus on evidence. But it was necessary to create a new category that in the case of kindergarten we call raw data, that we define descriptions that are unrelated to a claim or question, so we cannot say that they are part of an argument. For instance, snails are very soft. At the beginning, the children thought that the snails were disgusting. Probably that happens in many countries. But after 2 weeks, they had snails working over their bare arms and saying, for instance, snails are very soft. But this was not pursued as a question, so that's why we consider out. So we focus only on evidence that out of 276 utterances that we consider part of our arguments were the one that we consider evidence. And in this case, well, again, type of data. Following Kloskowski, we consider evidence data whose discursive role is to support a claim. So it's not just a mention to data, but it is data that are integrated in an argument. And we wanted to distinguish levels of epistemic judgment, because for us that is shows how data in the process of being transformed into evidence may be in different stages. So we began with 3 levels, but at the end we decided to collapse them in 2. So from these 57 evidence statements, 36 are very close to data. So for instance, we have here an argument about the body of the snails related to a display. So that was not produced by the students, but a chart that have, so a child says, snails have heart, brain. And this supports the claim that he makes after that, that is, they are almost like us. No? So you can see that this claim is supported in the idea that they have heart and brain, but nothing more developed. Whereas in 21 cases, there was some kind of evaluative judgment. I'm not going to enter into this. You can read the original paper. This is based on Tush's frame about the transformation of data in explanation. For instance, here we use as criteria if they were identifying patterns, connecting data to claim explicitly, comparing or evaluating alternatives. So an example, part of a discussion is that one morning the children find something very small that for them are baby snails in the box. They were looking at them every morning. And the teacher said they are excrements. But the teacher had very poor sight, I have to say this. So one of the children say, no, the name of the teacher. They are snails, newborn snails. Not, they have little horns. So in this case, this evidence that this little thing there has little horns, these newborn snails are smaller than a grain of rice. So means that comparing to excrements couldn't have horns, no? So in this case, we can see that they are more lower in the lower epistemic judgment level and 21 in the higher. And here we can see which one are based on data from purposeful observation, from experimentation, or from secondary sources. I will skip perhaps this for the negotiation, you have this in the paper. This is a notion that was elaborated by us, representing the degree of interaction in a group, the engagement with alternative ideas or position, drawing from Bakhtin's notion of dialogic interaction. So, in the chapter, and if you want the chapter and don't have the book, I can send you the file. If you are interested in negotiation, in argumentation, we can see how different groups had different negotiation levels. So, for instance, an example is the level 1 is the second from bottom. The negotiation, so options or justification or meanings are proposed but not compared to alternatives. So there's not really. So for instance, in this case, one of the student teachers say, do all of us agree omnivorous diet before really they engage in the discussion? This is at the beginning of the sessions. Okay, that means that they are not comparing this to the vegetarian diet. They later discuss the evidence after agreeing. Well, how do we support our results in evidence? Again, I'm focusing on qualitative studies. We were looking at how children were using evidence to revise their ideas. I have to say, and this is explained in the JST paper, that of course, as happened in all classrooms when argumentation is happening, as also was discussed by Professor Kim, this is due to the way that has the teacher of scaffolding the use of evidence in particular. In this classroom, all claims need to be supported in evidence. Even she says that explicitly. This is something that is shared in the whole group of teachers. This is to show when people say that it's very difficult to make children work with this, but it's possible to do it even in early childhood, so it should be possible with older ages. So we did a thematic analysis of conceptual topics that were recurring over more than one session, 2, 3, or 5. Again, this is a strategy of the teacher. She's revising what we learned, revising what we did, revising the experiments, revising the interpretation of experiments. So we selected the topic that was occurring over most sessions. That is a strange topic for this age, that are the mouth parts of snails, that of course are not directly visible. So the types of evidence used to revise were mainly, in this case, what we call purposeful observation, that we define it as prolonged in time, without target, strongly scaffolded by the teacher, and that are first-hand data, just as experimentation. So this is a summary, not all the moments are here. So how from January to May, the children had these emerging models or ideas. So in January, the teacher asked them, among other many drawings, you should draw what you think is inside its mouth. So they had the snails, but you cannot see what is inside their mouth, so they draw what is up there, and you can see it's very scary. It's like a big tongue, it's like teeth like of a shark. And from the 20 drawings that we collected in this session, the teacher collected them, well, all but one were looking like that. so she kept that, but then in February 24, so that to show that she was following children interest, she was not planning to discuss this, but in February, one children said, oh, there are these marks in the food that they were carrots. So he said, there are tunnels, there are deep holes. So in this moment, some of them say, this is not possible, thank you, to be, they cannot do this with teeth that are like ours, okay? So in March 21, they watched and discussed a video of a snail eating. They were looking at the snails eating flour over a glass panel. And in March 24, and this is typical of her scaffolding, she took out the drawings from 2 months before, handed them to each child and asked them to explain why they draw it like this. And they say, I thought it was like ours, like Danilo, the child who is holding that one. And then, will you draw it now the same way? Well, in May, they observed a limpet radula that the photograph is reproduced below through a digital microscope. And then the different explanations occur, like it is a zip fastener and a mechanism. While it's spinning, it's digging, because it makes deep holes. Well, if you are familiar with causal explanation, you know that proposing a mechanism is the step that is higher. So we think that is really is very exciting. So how we represented this? Well, it's a simple, after having other ideas, we come with a very simple figure that is representing the evidence and the changes in the idea. So from a tongue and teeth that are like ours, the evidence is either O means observation, S mean secondary sources, because the name radula was not, they had to recur to this. And here we can see a little bit of the discussion, like they don't eat carrots like we do, and you can see that they themselves and the teacher, they refer to the need for more evidence. So Elena says about the teeth, oh my, if they have them, we don't know that yet. So we have to look for this. And then Alberto says, they are smaller, the teeth. But the teacher says, that is what Alberto imagines. We will need to test it. Okay, so, well, I think I have to finish here. And only I want to say two things. First, that you need a lot of patience. Here I have two examples of our paper, science education paper in 2000 with a lot of citations, sent December 97, published 2000, okay? And this JRST paper sent December 2014, published at the end of 2016, so you need to be patient. But, as I say in a slide that I skip, thanks to referees and editors of journals is why these things improve. So don't think of the referees as your enemies, they are your friends. Okay, well, I think that in Korea you have a lot of conditions to build, as you have an emerging one, but to build a strong science education community as evidenced by many papers. I put some of the names, but for instance, I'm aware that there are at least 4 Kim scholars in science education whose papers are read. So, 감사합니다.
Thank you for your presentation. Since you talked about the argumentation in early childhood education, but you didn't mention teacher education part. What's the implication for, I mean, based on the students' argumentation and their discussions during the classroom? And what could you say about how and what should teachers do to increase or to encourage students' meaningful argumentation?
That will be a full talk. In fact, I thought I had more time when I wrote the paper, and here I skip most of the part on teacher education. But this part of the study was only focused on their negotiation. This was part of an argumentation sequence included in the science method. And what we plan in this teacher education is like three things. One is to teach about argumentation to student teacher. The second is to have them practicing argumentation, and that's why these tasks that they were doing. And the third is to have them to reflect and propose how they will translate this into the target group, in this case primary children. So I don't know, I mean, we can discuss the implications, but I agree with many of the things that have been said before. But in particular, I think that is very important because this is from both studies. In one case, we have the student teachers learning and engaging in argumentation. And in the other case, we have very young children, 5, 6, engaging in the use of evidence. And in this was instrumental the work of the teacher. We have a paper now that I hope is in the last batch of revision and soon be published about the scaffolding. The scaffolding of the teacher along the 3 years. So how she shifted from high intensity scaffolding to low intensity scaffolding. So that's something that we need to promote when we do teacher education, because it's not easy, it's not straightforward, and we need to be aware of the difficulties that teachers encounter. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thanks, María, for the talk. My question is really more just if you could expand a bit more about the nature of the sample and the nature of the study and what limits that puts on the claims you're making, because it seems to me it's a very specific qualitative study with one. I'm not quite sure how many teachers in one specific context, and doesn't that place limits on some of the claims you can make or not? I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
You're referring to the kindergarten or to, yeah. Well, of course, I mean, qualitative studies cannot make any claims about general disability. So the claims that we made are related to a particular context, because also, for instance, we are aware that in Spain, well, and probably in other countries, most early childhood education teachers don't work that way. We were very fortunate to have this group of teachers and that and to get access to their classrooms. So what we wanted to focus is a bit on what is possible, because we know that many studies in science education focus on the things that are not well performed. So students don't engage in argumentation, teachers don't attend to it. So a bit we are interested in the reverse, to showing that given certain circumstances, it's not an intervention study. I want to be very explicit about this. So this was the teacher project. Every year they conduct a science project. And the main thing that we did was to provide like, disciplinary support. So when they needed, I refer to digital microscopes. Perhaps you are thinking of something very sophisticated and expensive. No, it's something that costs $200 and is like a stereoscope that is digital, that aside. But so what we wanted was to document that given an environment when children are engaged in a long-term project, and this this follows what other people have been saying, like it's in the Next Generation Standard, what Dush has written about this. Projects have affordances that are completely different, because if these children have not been engaging with this, well, not every day in all these 5 months, but at least 2 days every week, and observing, and processes could not be observed. Processes about the snails are processes about their learning. So, and of course the limitations, I think, are obvious. We are making, the claims we are making is that projects in science afford many opportunities if we can do them. In secondary it's very, very difficult in Spain, that you have long time. Second, the work of the teacher is crucial. So for instance, the recurrence, how she was pursuing a few topics following the children's interests, and that even at this small age, I have to say that it's a school not in a privileged context. It's a rural part of a city, and the children are, well, mixed background, but not especially privileged. So given this, so to say, is not there are not developmental constraints. I mean, we will be on the side of Kathleen Metz rather than on the side of Diana Kuhn about this controversial issue. The children can do it. They can discuss evidence, and they can do a lot of things if we give them the opportunities. It's very difficult to say, could we apply this to other classrooms? Well, what we do claim is that in early childhood, in primary, and perhaps in secondary, we suggest purposeful observation can be a good tool, because many times we value experimentation in science education, but as in the Next Generation Standard, in inquiry approaches, we say that children should design the experiments. But in this classroom, we saw that it was very difficult. They were strongly scaffolded by the teacher in designing. They performed 7 experiments, but scaffolded. Whereas the purposeful observation, observing every day, recording, and this is, well, we think that for them is more, they can do it, and we suggest that we need to take into account that it's also first-hand data. So the claims that we made are relatively small in that sense. No, I don't know if I answered.